The way the war in Ukraine played out was always going to be about more than just bravery and battlefield outcomes. It's been a modern industrial war where endurance is a critical resource, and where one of the major unknowns has always been what would deplete first, Russian resources or Western political will. Last week, that question took an indisputably major turn, with Donald Trump coming out on top in the US presidential elections. For many countries, elections are mostly affairs of domestic significance. But when the contest is to determine who's going to lead the world's preeminent military power for the next 4 years, the rest of the world tends to pay very close attention. In the US election, the choice of government was relatively decisive and clear. How this is all now likely to play out for Ukraine, however, very much isn't. And so many around the world are now trying to determine exactly what a Trump White House will try and accomplish in Ukraine, what levers and leverage it's willing to deploy to get there, and how it may respond if Russia refuses to go along with the plans coming out of the Oval Office. Some things are already clear, that the war isn't over and Ukraine remains determined to resist, while Russia seems to want to keep its war effort grinding on. But beyond that, the uncertainty starts to compound. And so today, as the world is going through some seismic political shifts, we're going to talk about it. To do that, I'll start by looking at the dynamics in Ukraine right now, including some of the recent Russian offensives. Then I want to look at the US lame duck period, what happens between now and January 20th when the administration switch over. That'll be followed by a look at the incoming US administration, some of its key figures and what they've said about the war in Ukraine. But for the most part, I'm going to focus on the spectrum of policy options available to the White House and what the impact of each of them might be. Finally, we'll look at some of the challenges involved even with getting a ceasefire in Ukraine, why that process might pose some fairly extreme risks for the Ukrainians, and what it might potentially take to shift that into a more optimistic scenario. But before we jump into it, a quick word from a sponsor. When you see a news headline, it can sometimes be difficult to know if critical information is being left out, or if you're seeing the story from all the angles. If you look at stories about North Korean troops being sent to Ukraine, for example, this one gives the context that an estimated 10,000 troops being sent would be a significant increase on the previous Pentagon estimate of 3,000, but the preview mostly talks about those troops being sent to Russia to train. Flip over to this article and you lose the 3,000 figure, but you find out the US expects those North Korean troops to do a lot more than train, transitioning to fighting within the next several weeks. The tool being used to quickly flip between headlines here is called Ground News. They provide a website and app that draw on more than 50,000 sources around the world so that you can quickly and conveniently see how given stories are being covered. They also provide extra information on the sources being drawn on, including ownership information and ratings on political lean and factuality, reportedly based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. Dig deeper and you'll also find some interesting tools like the blind spot feed. This explicitly tries to surface stories that are primarily being covered by the kinds of sources you might not ordinarily consume, which can be pretty illuminating if you're trying to understand how narratives are developing in different parts of the information space. I've long supported Ground News on the channel as a potentially useful tool, and if you don't already have it, now might be a particularly good time to get it. For a limited time, if you click the link in the description, you'll get access to a 50% discount on their unlimited access Vantage plan. So if you're interested, give the link a click, and with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. Okay, so I wanted to start here by quickly talking about the fighting in Ukraine as it's currently playing out. Because while yes, much of the world has been engrossed watching the quasi-gladiatorial process of people in the United States competing for future White House positions, the battles in Ukraine have continued at a high level of intensity. We'll keep this relatively brief as there'll probably be a wider update on the war relatively soon as the Russian invasion crosses the 1,000-day mark. But suffice to say, recent days have seen some major Russian offensive actions, not just in the Donbass, but against Ukraine's little special military operations zone in Russian territory. There, we've seen a significant flow of visually confirmed loss data, reportedly belonging to some pretty top-shelf Russian units. Think paratroopers and naval infantry, but despite the quality of the forces involved, so far a lot of these attacks appear to be hitting a metaphorical wall, with losses apparently out of all proportion to the territory that's been confirmed taken, and there being every expectation that despite that, there's going to be a lot more to come. A big question arising from that is probably just why, or at least why now? And one theory, noting it is just a theory and impossible to confirm, is that the Russian military might be feeling a bit of a political imperative here, with a push to eject the Ukrainians from any internationally recognised Russian territory, forgetting all that claimed Russian territory for a moment, before we see that changeover in the US administration come late January. And that in turn might indicate a desire on Russia's part to shore up its bargaining position ahead of 2025. It's worth noting at this point that neither Moscow or Kyiv are anywhere near achieving their stated war goals. At average pace, Russia is still decades away from reaching its stated territorial goals and has indicated that the dropping of Western sanctions would be a prerequisite to any ceasefire negotiations, which is obviously a very Interesting bargaining position. I too would enjoy it if everyone I negotiated with agreed to give up a whole bunch of their leverage before we even started talking, but that demand is likely to be a bit of a non-starter in any negotiations where the Ukrainian representative is not just Sergei Lavrov in a wig. On the other side, Ukraine has said they want to end the war with their territory returned, war criminals punished, and security guarantees in place. So at a macro scale, a lot of this very attritional fighting we're seeing probably has a variety of objectives for both sides, including trying to break down and attrit the opponent's military capability to a point where they're encouraged to accept a deal different to the one they're currently proposing. This style of fighting isn't, and never has been, sustainable for either side. Ukraine is already straining its national resources and dependent on whatever its allies are able to supply. Meanwhile, Russia's own military efforts are largely based on finite pools of financial and military resources. When you have Russian state media covering a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Russia's state-owned film studio discussing how, as far back as 2023, the film studio transferred a number of tanks and armoured vehicles that it was using as movie props to the Russian military, including 28 T-55s, 8 PT-76s and 6 BMPs, that probably says something about the gap between needs and productive capacity. The US military has had to face budget cuts in the past, but I don't think we ever saw them raiding the Band of Brothers set for a couple of Shermans. So the key question ahead of any potential negotiation usually hasn't been which side is going to win decisively militarily and fly its flag over the enemy capital, but instead it's often been about the relative military balance, the trend over time, and who both sides expect to run out of steam first. That's where the future policy of the United States, as the world's premier military power and Ukraine's most important single arms supplier, comes in. But before we even get to the actual Trump presidency and what it might mean for Ukraine, there are still massive questions over what happens between now and January 20th. Because as per the US Constitution, the elections might be over, but the Biden presidency isn't. And so now, for roughly the next 2 months at time of recording, we're in what's often called a lame duck period, where an old government knows that it's been voted out, but still at the helm. Now, in terms of length, the US lame duck period is far from holding any kind of international record, particularly in countries where you'd normally have to have a negotiation between multiple parties to form a coalition after an election has taken place before a new government can be sworn in. Interim arrangements can last a very long time, with many of the records being set by Belgium, who managed to have an election on the 13th of June 2010 and not form a government until December 2011. That set a 589-day record, which would be repeatedly beaten in the following years by Belgium. So sure, by that comparator, the US is absolutely blazing through the transition process, but for viewers from countries like the United Kingdom or Australia, where transition may only be a matter of days from election to new administration, the duration of the American lame duck period might come as a bit of a surprise. And historically, these periods haven't just been about smoothing the transition process, they're also the stage of presidential administrations where things can get a bit wild. Because sure, on one hand, no one may be taking your calls anymore because you're going to be out of office in January, but on the other hand, you're going to be out of office in January. You're probably not going to be on the ballot next election. It's years away anyway. And so, for better or worse, historically presidents have sometimes made their final weeks and months in office some of the most quote-unquote productive of their presidencies. Pardons are a big one. Bill Clinton issued 176 pardons and commutations on his final day in office, while Donald Trump managed to get in about 144 pardons and commutations on his final day. The podium prize for sheer lame duck period audacity, however, may well go to John Adams, who used his final days in office before Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans came into office to appoint a new Chief Justice, cut the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 6 to 5, and of course created 16 new federal judgeships which were filled with Federalist appointees. As Clinton's Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt put it in 2000, even lame ducks have wings. But in the context of the war in Ukraine, arguably a lame duck period is especially, well, special. Mostly because of the very strange things it can temporarily do to everyone's risk and payoff calculus. For example, under ordinary circumstances, if you're the United States trying to make an escalation decision in Ukraine, for example, you have to weigh up a couple of factors. For better or worse, that has to include how it might affect the next election, how it might influence your relationship with your allies. And in the case of dealing with a nuclear-armed opponent like Russia, the small but non-zero chance that you will accidentally put your opponent in a position where they feel that they have absolutely no alternative other than to flip the chessboard and declare a nuclear war. Except for the next 2 months, none of those risks really bind decision-makers in the same way. There is no election to win, and allies and enemies alike are both probably going to be aware of the fact that they don't need to take extreme action because they're going to be dealing with someone new in about 2 months anyway. From a Russian perspective, nuclear war or a conventional all-out war with NATO is probably a very suboptimal outcome with some very permanent consequences. So you can imagine a situation would have to be pretty bloody extreme for that to be considered the preferred option, as opposed to just waiting for things to change in 2 months. And so the first question for Ukraine probably isn't anything to do with the Trump administration, it's what is Biden going to do with this escalation hall pass in hand? One step has already been publicly announced, and that's to get all the aid that's been authorised by Congress shipped or committed by January 20th. Assuming that means everything left in Presidential Drawdown Authority, plus whatever's left in the USAI program, the Pentagon's clarified that would be $7.1 billion worth of presidential drawdown, so weapons and equipment out of US stocks, and $2.2 billion in USAI. Commit and deliver that over the course of 2 and a bit months, and you're not looking at a massive surge by the standards of this war, but numbers that might still be absolutely critical to Ukraine's ability to meet its requirements in the near term. To borrow House Stark's famous truism, winter is coming. And with Russia seemingly building up forces ahead of a potential winter campaign and, of course, stockpiling long-range missiles, the news that the United States was planning to deliver roughly 500 surface-to-air missiles in the coming weeks was probably particularly welcome. As best we can tell, Russia's winter strategic bombing campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure may already have begun. Sure, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz may have called Putin on the 15th of November, urging him against further escalation in the war, but remarkably, that doesn't appear to have stopped Moscow launching one of the largest combined missile and drone attacks of the war shortly thereafter. We've also seen the White House make another change, which has been called for since 2022, but long shelved in the name of escalation concerns. Just after the election, it was announced the US would be lifting restrictions on some United States civilian contractors going to Ukraine to fix US origin weapon systems. These aren't US military personnel, they're civilian contractors who are paid, often very well, to fill non-combat roles. And these changes will enable at least some of those contractors to go to Ukraine, either to fix equipment themselves or provide training in person to the Ukrainians, which will probably have at least some impact on the serviceability of Western equipment in Ukrainian service. Fixing a Patriot battery or F-16, for example, might be difficult at the best of times. Trying to do it remotely through a language barrier, using a spotty internet connection for your video call, that's probably another level entirely. And of course, from an escalation perspective, in response to this announced change, we've seen basically nothing. With one exception, that covers most of the steps the White House has announced since the election. But with about 2 months left on the clock, I think it's worth briefly exploring the kind of sliding scale of options that the administration still has available to it, should it choose to access them. If the White House wants to try and get more equipment and munitions into Ukrainian hands without additional congressional funding, there are a couple of ways they can potentially do it. One example here is the excess defence articles power. It's meant to be used to take equipment that the US military doesn't need anymore and might have to, for example, spend money disposing of, and instead hand it off to an ally. There are a number of restrictions on how you use EDA, including the fact that equipment generally has to be taken on an as-is, where-is basis. Basically, this is the military equivalent of putting something up for next to free on Facebook Marketplace and saying pick up only. EDA transfers really can range from the hilariously small to the strategically significant. In fiscal year 2023, I imagine someone at the Defence Security Cooperations Agency was absolutely thrilled to do all the admin involved in transferring to American ally Greece a single wrench, original value $11.48, adjusted value $5.74. How exactly the US military decided that that particular wrench was surplus to requirements, and whether Ukraine will now fall because Greece got the wrench instead of them, is very difficult to know. But we can also say with confidence that in the same year, Greece received some much larger transfers, like 4 Coast Guard patrol boats and 393 armoured security vehicles, while one line item for Egypt covered 350 MRAPs. That's more than 700 armoured vehicles and 4 patrol boats. Original value more than $500 million, adjusted value closer to $54 million. That single transfer to Egypt, by the way, included enough vehicles to replace every single MRAP that Ukraine is visually confirmed to have lost since February 2022. So these transfers can absolutely happen at a scale that could potentially move the needle. So one potential way to use this power might be to mark equipment as excess, hand it off to allies, and then have them handle the task of supplying Ukraine. You could even potentially spin up a kind of military equipment drop shipping arrangement, where the US first ships everything to Germany, and then, as allies agree deliveries to Ukraine, the US declares the material excess and hands it off to allies. It isn't actually that simple, nor is it likely to be a complete solution, but it is an example of an available tool. Another would be to leverage foreign aid, assistance and loan powers that aren't directly related to Ukraine for Ukraine-related purposes, or to look very, very closely at the valuation of military equipment being sent. The Pentagon has already, on at least 2 occasions, had to revise upwards the amount of funding it still has left for Ukraine because it turns out it was overvaluing a lot of what was being sent. Just as there can be some creative ways to make equipment more expensive, there can be some equally creative ways to make it considerably cheaper, at least on paper. And so, hypothetically, if the White House and Pentagon want to move the Boxing Day sales up a bit and apply them to armoured vehicles and missiles, rather than widescreen TVs and gift hampers, there might be some scope to take the funding that is there and stretch it a little further. A final option, which we can't really explore in detail just because of how many potential configurations there might be, would be to embrace some kind of indirect approach, where you take something that the White House can already still do without additional funding approved by Congress and use that to give another country a sweetener in exchange for them providing their military equipment to Ukraine. That's obviously a very wide-reaching option, where the primary limits are diplomatic and political creativity. But it's worth noting that in all of these cases, choosing to use these mechanisms is something that might come with drawbacks for the White House. There is, after all, a reason it didn't lean on these sort of tactics the last time aid got held up. But with this now being a case of an administration in its lame duck period, we might see something different this time. Then there are the options that involve the White House giving not so much more stuff, but instead more permissions. After all, the logic might go, an escalation hall pass isn't really worth much unless you use it, and you don't need funding from Congress to tell the Ukrainians that you'd love to see a couple more Russian air bases or arsenals explode. There are a couple of big ones in this column, including signing off on allies transferring a range of systems to Ukraine, even if they include US components or proprietary technologies, giving Ukraine permission to use US-supplied weapons in internationally recognised Russian territory, and ramping up things like intelligence sharing up until the January 20 buzzer. We're probably at a point now where the US giving permission to strike into Russia probably wouldn't be worth as much as it once was. Mostly because the permission to fire missiles doesn't mean much if you don't have many missiles, and the US has neither massively ramped up the supply of long-range munitions nor sent potentially the best weapon for the job, the AGM-158. But giving permissions to Ukraine now would still likely deliver a boost, and this may be, from an escalation standpoint, the safest time to do it. And Future Prune quickly jumping in to say that apparently the White House agreed with that logic, with it being reported that the White House has now authorised Ukraine to use long-range American weapons like ATACMS against Russian territory, although it sounds like, at least initially, that might be focused just on Kursk, thus significantly increasing the odds of something that probably wasn't on the 2022 bingo cards, North Korean troops being hit by long-range American missiles in Russia. Moving on then to something potentially much more impactful but also less likely, there's nothing technically stopping President Biden trying to lash together a coalition to pass additional Ukraine aid before January 20th. Depending on what was in it, that could potentially give the Ukrainians much more runway to work with before they became wholly reliant on the new incoming US administration to adopt some measures of their own. That said, any attempt like this one would probably run into a lot of the same barriers we've seen previously, and the fact that even getting a vote on this kind of motion in the House would require the cooperation of Speaker Mike Johnson. Hence why this got placed much further down the probability list than the US adopting a pro-smoking accidents policy. And then, of course, for completeness, we need to flag that the US presidency is an exceptionally powerful office. And so there is a long, long list of potential measures that fall into the category of hypothetically possible but incredibly improbable, short of Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan suddenly becoming NCD subscribers. Hypothetically, you could do almost anything from giving Ukraine a submarine with which to conduct a campaign of privateering against Russian ships around the world, through to just unleashing American air power to try and kick the Russians out of Ukraine. However, sober analysis requires identifying not just what's possible, but what's probable. And I'd argue the much more likely scenario, based on our observations since February 2022, is a much more restrained White House and a rapidly closing window for additional action. Allied governments are also likely, in their own ways, to be re-evaluating their strategies to make sure they best align with their interests in light of the new incoming administration. The South Korean government, for example, has explicitly not ruled out sending weapons directly to Ukraine, something which would potentially make a major difference in the war, but it seems relatively unlikely that that kind of decision would be taken without an effort to first understand how the incoming Trump administration would likely respond. Some, like France and the United Kingdom, have publicly suggested they're digging in around a policy of long-term Ukraine support. Others, like Orban, will probably be looking for support to push European policy in a direction much more favourable to Moscow. And future German government policy will probably have to wait for there to be a future German government first, with the current coalition having collapsed and snap elections due in early 2025. None of this is likely to define US policy in December or January, but it is a factor to consider. So if we're just looking for an indicative scenario, something to illustrate how the next 2 months might go from a Ukrainian perspective, let's go ahead and bolt together a couple of assumptions. Let's say that none of the more out there options get adopted. There's no additional aid package, there's no shenanigans with aid valuation, and the US doesn't take any potentially escalatory steps. What we assume it does do is deliver 100% of what it says it's going to deliver by the time it says it's going to deliver it. If we assume Russia's going to ramp up activity basically as expected over winter, and that European deliveries remain relatively constant and don't adjust to compensate, that probably puts Ukraine in a position where they start feeling supply constrained on some of their US-dependent systems in the latter part of Q1 2025, with those issues exacerbating, potentially quite badly, in Q2. There are some ways that could potentially be mitigated, but in this war presuming an upside is seldom a safe bet. There probably isn't room in the budget at this point, for example, to introduce a bunch of top-shelf equipment or entirely new systems lines. The Ukrainians will always want more Patriot batteries, for example, but even if the US military was willing to spare them, that would probably chew through the remaining budget too quickly for comfort at this point. Instead, if the goal is to maximise the impact of what's still to be sent without any assumption as to what might be going in the future, it seems logical that we'll see three things focused on. Firstly, shoring up sustainment. That means making sure the Ukrainians have the spare parts they need to keep their US-supplied systems operating potentially for months without additional supply. Not receiving any more Bradleys, for example, might be damaging for Ukraine, but not being able to operate the ones they already have would be devastating. Spare parts are absolutely essential to combat power, relatively cost-effective from the aid giver's perspective, and can be supplied in advance and stockpiled. Unlike, for example, training services that need to be supplied when they're consumed. We should also see the United States supplying fewer generic goods and more things that it can supply that others can't. Finally, you might expect to see small, cheap, but symbolic escalations that put the incoming administration in the strongest possible bargaining position while exploiting whatever temporary escalation window might exist. An outlier option, for example, would be for the US to provide some sort of new capability, but in relatively small numbers, just to break the taboo. Any large-scale supply of a new system, however, seems comparatively unlikely, because you can't be sure that the sustainment pipeline is going to be there past January 20. The long story short here is there's still plenty of things the current White House can do to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position through the first few months of 2025. But beyond that, it's going to come down to how the new White House chooses to chart its course. So let's pivot then to talking about what might happen after January 20th. The old administration is out, so the new one is in, and to a significant extent, Ukraine's fate probably hangs in the balance. For this section though, I really want to flag the limits of what I'm trying to do. There are lots of different types of analytics work out there. For example, some people try and focus on understanding the psychology and decision-making of particular individuals, whereas I focus much more on the potential mechanical impacts of a particular action being taken. If this was 2021, for example, I could happily tell you why Russia invading Ukraine would be a massive risk for its military and economy, but I would happily defer to more of the Kremlin whisperer crowd to determine if Putin was likely to do it anyway. In a similar vein, I'm not sure an Aussie running a defence economics channel is the right person to tell you exactly what Ukraine policy the new White House is likely to adopt. And as for US domestic policy, Americans, I will very much leave that to you. Instead, what I can tell you is what we know about the decision makers that are likely to be in the room, the policy options that are available, and the potential impacts that may come with them being adopted or not. On the decision-maker front, as an outsider looking in, it's worth flagging that the American Republican Party is a bit of a broad tent when it comes to Ukraine policy. In a sense, that matches some of the results we've seen in opinion polling, with one in the second half of 2024 showing that the share of Republican respondents saying the US was spending too much to militarily support Ukraine was just over 50%, as opposed to less than 20% for Democrats and around a third for the US population as a whole. Within that 52-odd%, you'd also have to imagine there's a divide between those who think aid should be reduced and those who think it should be stopped entirely. Switch from looking at Republicans to Republican leaders, and you'll also find a spectrum. On one hand, you do have some avowed Russia hawks, and on the other, people like Donald Trump Jr. He recently gained a bit of attention by tweeting a meme of Ukrainian President Zelensky with the caption reading, "When you're 38 days from losing your allowance." Now, the slant of comments like this is very much anti-Ukraine. And Don Jr. has also reportedly suggested that there would be no place for, quote, war hawks in his father's cabinet. So let's go over a couple of the figures that will actually hold officers with influence over Ukraine policy, starting with two that we already know will be there. Noting that for this section, I'm really not interested in any of their policy positions other than what they've said on Ukraine. The first is Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, who has been a consistent voice and vote against US assistance for Ukraine. In March 2022, he reportedly said, quote, "I gotta be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine, one way or another," end quote. Meanwhile, in May, he reportedly said, quote, "I do not think it is in America's interest to continue to fund an effectively never-ending war in Ukraine. We've done more than our fair share." and at various times seemed to argue both that Russia wasn't that much of a priority because it wasn't that dangerous. Quote, I do not think that Vladimir Putin is an existential threat to Europe, end quote, but has also seemed to imply that Russia is so strong that the US and its allies couldn't possibly deliver enough weapons to turn the tide. Quote, in that world of scarcity, we can't support Ukraine and the Middle East and contingencies in East Asia. It just doesn't make sense. The math doesn't work out in terms of weapons manufacturing. End quote. Given the soon-to-be vice president has also said that he is, quote, more interested in some of the problems in East Asia right now than I am in Europe, end quote, I'd suggest that might indicate a strong policy preference for redirecting resources away from Ukraine. At the other end of the spectrum, the new leader of the Republican Senate majority is going to be Senator John Thune. He's been a vocal supporter of Ukraine, a consistent vote in favour of previous Ukraine aid packages, and declared a little earlier this year that, quote, America cannot retreat from the world stage. So I'm sure the new Senate Majority Leader will get on absolutely fine with the nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. And regarding the war in Ukraine, she's reportedly said that, quote, this war and suffering could easily have been avoided if NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, end quote. We're not going to dive back into that particular Russian talking point today, other than to flag that it is a Russian talking point. And as for Russian state media, they're very much fans. In 2022, Vladimir Solovyov referred to her as our girlfriend Tulsi, and the tone doesn't appear to have shifted that much in 2024, with one host remarking of Trump's various nominees, they aren't friends of Russia, except for Tulsi Gabbard, end quote. Both Sputnik and Russia Today have run recent articles on her, with the one on the right headlined Tulsi Gabbard right pick to shake up US spy agencies, and attributing that sentiment to a CIA veteran. Obviously, Russia can say whatever it wants on state media for a variety of purposes, and of course, they can lie. But it's a pretty stark contrast to what they've been saying about the people likely to fill other roles, like Senate Majority Leader, Secretary of State, or National Security Advisor. The Gabbard nomination may be a particularly interesting one to watch from an allied dynamics perspective, because if you're a US ally with a strong pro-Ukrainian position, you may have to be fairly on top of your ongoing risk assessment process before you decide to share intelligence with your US colleagues, knowing who might be at the apex of that US intelligence apparatus. Media in US ally Japan has also raised some concerns over statements like this one reportedly made in 2023. Quote, as we remember Japan's aggression in the Pacific, we need to ask ourselves this question. Is the remilitarization of Japan, which is presently underway, truly a good idea? End quote. That line stands in interesting contrast to what appears to be a likely policy of the incoming Trump administration to pivot more US attention towards the Asia-Pacific, which would presumably significantly rely on defence investments being made by US regional allies like the Republic of Korea and Japan. The reason I bring this up is solely to suggest that there might be some policy differences between Ms. Gabbard and some of the other people on this list. Speaking of the National Security Advisor role, the position currently filled by Jake Sullivan, Trump's nominee for that position appears to be Florida Congressman Michael Waltz, who's also a retired colonel and former Green Beret. Much of the media has described him as a hawk on China, but his record on Ukraine is a bit more mixed. He voted for US aid to Ukraine in 2022 and 2023, and then against it in 2024, with there being a couple of quotes out there that might be illustrative. In September 2023, he reportedly said that, quote, stopping Russia before it draws NATO and therefore the US into war is the right thing to do, but the burden cannot continue to be solely on the shoulders of the American people, especially while Western Europe gets a pass. There must be a policy space between Biden's current strategy of as long as it takes and those demanding not another dollar. Before the nomination was announced, Waltz actually gave an interview in which he talked a little bit about potential Russia strategy. That included the potential to exercise leverage against Russia by enforcing energy sanctions, while also saying, quote, I think that will get Putin to the table. We have leverage, like taking the handcuffs off of long-range weapons we provided to Ukraine as well. And then, of course, I think we have plenty of leverage with Zelensky to get them to the table, end quote. Other key nominees include Marco Rubio, who's up for the job of Secretary of State, basically America's chief diplomat, who is, again, generally described in the media as a bit of a China hawk, but who, on the topic of Ukraine, has been full of statements of admiration about the country, saying Ukrainians have, quote, been incredibly brave and strong in standing up to Russia, but who voted against the 2024 aid package. As to how the conflict might end, Rubio has reportedly said, quote, I would be comfortable with a deal that ends these hostilities and I think is favourable to Ukraine, meaning they have their own sovereignty, that they don't become a satellite or a puppet state that is constantly being held hostage by the Russians. As to how exactly Russia might be pressured to accept a peace deal favourable to Ukraine isn't something that was clearly expressed in that article. Finally, Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense is Pete Hegseth, former Army National Guard major, and more recently a weekend co-host of Fox and Friends. In 2022, Hesketh described Putin as a war criminal and criticised the Joe Biden administration for not equipping Ukraine fast enough. At the time, he reportedly said, quote, "What's at stake is repelling an authoritarian who is basically saying, I want the Soviet Union back, I want Ukraine back, I want Kyiv back." More recently, though, he's reportedly said that the US burned 2 decades of money in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that it was tempted to do it again in Ukraine. And according to one article, he suggested that he doesn't believe Putin would go that much further than Ukraine, which may not be the most reassuring statement to those countries and people living just that little bit further than Ukraine. Now, of course, we could potentially spend hours looking at each of these nominees and candidates and dissecting their records, but in the end, the person whose opinion matters most is going to be the one making the final decision. And from late January onwards, that's going to be Donald Trump. I'm not going to try and go through everything Trump has ever said about the war in Ukraine, Zelensky, Putin, NATO, the US's strategic interests, etc. If you're watching this channel, you're probably fairly across Trump's statements on those topics. Instead, I'm going to focus on what he said during his campaign he's going to try and achieve. And that basically boils down to an end to the war, something which he suggested would be possible within 24 hours of him entering office. Now, arguably, in and of itself, pursuing a negotiated end to the fighting in Ukraine isn't a revolutionary policy position. With relatively few exceptions, historically conflicts do end at the negotiating table. The differences instead often come in how you choose to get there and what you prioritise in doing so. Do you focus, for example, on keeping escalation risk as low as possible, getting the best deal possible, or getting a deal as quickly as possible, to name just a couple? And in Trump's case, many of the statements seem to suggest a focus on getting a deal done quickly. And we have seen the Ukrainian president come out and appear to publicly match that assessment, indicating, to quote from a BBC article, he is certain the war with Russia will end sooner than it otherwise would have once Donald Trump becomes US president. Now, bringing a rapid end to a war that'll be pretty close to going into its 4th year by the time Trump enters office was always going to be a very ambitious goal. All the more so since the Russian ambassador to the United Nations has publicly said that it can't be done, and that any attempt by a Ukrainian government to just surrender to Russia at this point would probably lead to the fall of said government. The gap between the two parties' negotiating positions continues to make the Grand Canyon look like a bloody hairline fracture. A key challenge the Trump administration is likely to face here, then, is very similar to that faced by any other administration or actor that has said they want to see a peace deal. Namely, how? Here it might be useful to think of the problem at a little more abstract level. You have two primary actors, the Russians and Ukrainians, who are both miles apart at the negotiating table, and then from a US perspective, you also have other potentially interested parties, like your international allies. If your first goal is to get a peace deal, any peace deal, what you basically need to do is bring the Russian and Ukrainian bargaining positions closer together. Just getting them to sit down at the negotiating table alone probably isn't going to accomplish anything, as long as their demands are completely and absolutely mutually incompatible. And so in terms of how the United States might encourage, in inverted commas, the parties to get there, you can think of there as being a kind of policy spectrum. I've set out a couple of non-mutually exclusive options on the right there, with those towards the top generally being focused on pressuring the Russians, while those on the bottom are focused on forcing Ukraine to make additional concessions. Since 2022, I'd argue that US policy has mostly fit into that sustain category, where Ukraine has never been provided the kind of assistance it might need to inflict decisive defeats on Russia, but has been provided at least most of what it needs to continue fighting Russia. One perceived goal there might be to minimise escalation risk, while slowly driving the Russians mad with attrition, in the hopes they'd eventually come to the table and agree to acceptable conditions. An escalation-based strategy would probably do away with some of those restraints and strategic patience in favour of maximising pressure on Russia, giving Ukraine more and better capabilities to hit Russia where it really hurts and drive up attrition, for example, in the hopes of pushing the Russians to the negotiating table. When Waltz talks about going after Russian energy revenues or authorising strikes into Russian territory, that arguably falls into this kind of category. Both of these options, though, probably come with at least some political drawbacks. The sustain option is very close to the Biden administration's policy, while taking more of a peace through strength and tough negotiating position approach may not be compatible with pledges to reduce spending on Ukraine assistance. That's something you're probably more likely to see with options from the bottom half of the chart. Although many of these are more likely to have the impact of increasing the pressure on Ukraine to accept harsh Russian conditions, as opposed to focusing all of the policy stick on Moscow. One way the new administration could try to cut Ukraine expenditure, for example, would be to push more of those expenses onto European allies. The US could indicate to European states that it's mostly willing to stay the course on Ukraine policy, but only as long as they pick up more of the tab. This would align with some of the past rhetoric we've seen from people like Michael Waltz accusing some Western European countries of getting a pass. In that respect, just based on the numbers to date, there are probably 3 statements we can make up front. The first is that, at least from a financial perspective, the transfer of burden from the United States to European countries has already been happening. There are a number of ways to calculate this, obviously, but according to the methodology of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, there were periods, like Q3 2022, when the United States allocated more assistance to Ukraine than Europe did. But in late 2023 and through 2024, Europe has allocated a lot more than the United States have. In percentage of GDP terms, the United States is at a fraction of the levels some other countries have reached, like Denmark, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Sweden and Poland. It is, of course, the largest individual donor country, but that has a lot to do with the fact the US economy is the size of the US economy. By virtue of their geographic position and economic structures, European states have also arguably carried a majority of certain costs, like dealing with the sudden transition away from Russian energy or supporting Ukrainian refugees on European territory. But leaving political factors and the current balance aside for a moment, what about the basic question there? If the US wanted to push Europe to pick up more of the tab, is the capacity there? In raw financial terms, the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is very yes. Many European economies have been facing headwinds for some time, and governments are obviously going to have competing priorities. But the raw balance of financial resources between the Russian Federation and the various European NATO states becomes abundantly clear once you remember that, in nominal terms, the Russian economy is about the same size as Italy's, a fraction of the size of Germany's, and that one wealthy European state, Norway, population roughly 5.5 million, has enough assets in its pension fund to match the official Russian defence budget, dollar for more than a decade. Even if you adjust for purchasing power parity, which significantly boosts the Russian figures, you still only need to, for example, bolt together Germany and Poland before you have a European entity with more economic muscle than Russia does. And of course, adding the United States back onto the chart doesn't make things any prettier. This obviously doesn't mean that European capitals are going to be keen to pick up more of the financial cost of the war. The recent trend has been very much in the other direction, and many European states have been facing significant social and economic headwinds. But if the political will is there, theoretically the money can be too. Especially since it's Europe, not the United States, holding on to the vast majority of those hundreds of billions of dollars worth of frozen Russian assets. Where things could potentially get much more complicated there, however, is when you start talking about military aid. There are a number of European states that probably want to continue supporting Ukraine that are long on financial firepower, but short on actual firepower. And while European defence industrial production has started to expand since 2022, there are still likely to be the twin problems in certain equipment categories of Europe not producing enough quantity and occasionally not producing the right products at all. If you look just at the question of artillery ammunition and long-range fires, for example, you can see both problems potentially come into play. For a basic, somewhat interchangeable product, with a little bit of an asterisk there, like a 155mm artillery shell, Europe is home to some major producers, and German giant Rheinmetall says their goal is to produce up to 700,000 artillery shells and 10,000 tonnes of powder per year from 2025. That's absolutely significant, especially as you'd expect those German shells to be of relatively high quality. But in the context of a war where we've seen North Korea able to supply Russia with shells by the millions, European capacity alone is likely to miss the mark on what Ukraine needs. But at least in that case, there is an alternative supply source for Ukraine, even if it's not a perfect one or available on the scale that they might want. In other cases, their options really do begin and end with the United States. Last week, for example, we talked about Ukraine's HIMARS and M270 rocket artillery systems and the immensely important role that they played, serving as counter-battery weapons, attacking operational targets like ammunition depots and headquarters, as well as, at least according to the video evidence we've seen so far, being one of Ukraine's primary weapons against Russian air defence systems. There are likely far fewer than 100 Western-type MRLs in Ukraine, but they've had an impact so far out of proportion to their numbers. One potential problem for Ukraine, though, is that while there are a lot of countries out there with HIMARS or M270s in inventory, at least until Australia stands up production facilities of its own, if you were going to say the Gimlis rocket had one main home, it would probably be Camden, Arkansas. And somehow I don't expect the citizens of that great state to be applying for EU membership anytime soon. This is part of the reason why nations might be so invested in finding ways, and we'll discuss a few in the moment, to potentially keep US military aid flowing. Because the alternative, if US supplies don't keep arriving, is that eventually, inevitably, every HIMARS and M270 in Ukraine will eventually go silent. Similarly, as we flagged a bit earlier, for those American systems that have already been sent to Ukraine and which are being used for vitally important battlefield roles, spare parts will almost inevitably become an issue eventually if the United States doesn't maintain the supplies necessary to sustain those vehicles. Now, to be fair, there is going to be a massive variation in how much of a problem this is likely to be, platform by platform, based on factors like where the production lines are and what international spare parts stockpiles look like. Things like M113s are likely to be at the much simpler end of the spectrum. There are thousands upon thousands of vehicles out there, basically everyone has them, and the system is, relatively speaking, so mechanically simple that you half expect some Ukrainian retirees to be able to maintain the thing using nothing more than a hammer, a welding torch and some Slavic magic. Then you have middling cases, like the F-16 fighters or the M1A1 main battle tanks, where there are significant inventories outside the United States, but the platform involved is significantly more complex, and so the odds that you might need something from a US supplier increases accordingly. Then, finally, there are difficult cases. Where does Ukraine get Bradley spares, for example, other than the United States? Where does Ukraine get the equipment to repair US-supplied air defense radars? These are areas where European support might be of some assistance, but ultimately US cooperation is going to be required. Otherwise here, and in a number of other areas, you're likely to see a Ukrainian military that has evolved into using more American and NATO-type equipment. Will have to, in a sense, follow the Russian example and devolve their equipment sets back into whatever they can sustain and access, rather than what's best for the job. So if you're looking at ways the Europeans and Ukrainians might encourage the United States to keep those vitally needed military supplies flowing, one way, as we just discussed, might be as part of an agreement for European states to ramp up efforts in other areas, while another possibility, noting I'm charting possibilities here, not probabilities, is the US moves towards what you might call commercialization, where they basically say you can have our weapons and equipment, but only if someone pays for them. That might mean through third-party funding, seized Russian assets, loans or a lend-lease type structure, and notably in the past, Trump has seemed to suggest that future aid to Ukraine might come in loan form. But given that Ukraine is a country with an economy roughly the size of Nebraska's, engaged in a life or death struggle against a major military power, there would probably be some very serious limitations on what they can afford without additional external assistance. Finally, if the goal was to really try and turn the screws on the Ukrainians as opposed to the Russians, the US could adopt a policy of disengagement where it simply refuses to ship any more weapons even if they're paid for, as we briefly saw done with US supplies to Saudi Arabia. Or even more dramatically and unlikely would be the US adopting an obstructionist position, where they don't just refuse to send or sell their weapons, they actively block other countries from sending theirs as well. In particular, those built in the US or containing US technology. Now, actively sabotaging the Ukrainian war effort and preventing allies from sending US-designed or US-built systems to assist would probably cause some very intense responses from various US allies, while also potentially setting up large portions of the US defence industry for some serious Switzerland syndrome. As the Swiss have arguably discovered since 2022, it can become difficult to market your weapon systems internationally if you adopt a policy of not allowing them to transfer those systems to friendly or allied countries when they're under attack. That gives the United States some fairly compelling incentives to avoid that kind of scenario, especially given that the knock-on effects could potentially affect the US military's own plans for equipment acquisition and modernisation, not just the health of America's alliances or the strategically important defence industrial base. At this point, significant parts of the US military, like the Army and the defence industrial base, have become major beneficiaries of Ukraine and Ukraine-related funding. Often funding appropriated to replace older equipment sent to Ukraine hasn't been used for like replacement, but instead to ramp up procurement of newer equipment and push modernisation. The US has sent a bunch of M113s to Ukraine, for example, but it's not buying new M113s with its funding. Instead, it's going for things like AMPVs. A drop-off in overseas interest and sales would also potentially pose a threat to the profitability and scale of the US defence sector. If you're not selling as much abroad, you may not be able to justify as much investment in scale production. And if you're not scaling production and investing, the US military could easily find itself paying higher unit prices for equivalent capabilities. It's one thing to put sanctions and export restrictions on a country like North Korea or Iran, but it's another to impose them on a friendly state and ally currently engaged in a life or death struggle against one of your main strategic opponents. And so suffice to say, there are some pretty compelling strategic reasons for the US to never go close to this option. But for sake of completeness, I thought it was worth noting that America's escalation options run pretty wide in both directions. But I think the extreme nature and potential consequences of that last option also serve to highlight a wider point, that US policy settings regarding Ukraine can't really be set in a vacuum, because they have to operate in the context of whatever wider policy objectives the US administration decides to set. For example, it might be possible to make the argument that the United States should rebalance more of its forces and efforts towards the Asia-Pacific to deter and compete with China, as opposed to focusing on Ukraine. But if you start to play that out a bit, you might start to see more and more interrelationships between the two and find yourself asking a couple of questions. For example, how could the United States expect to credibly deter the People's Republic of China if it couldn't deter the much weaker, comparatively speaking, Russian Federation? Deterrence is often about a lot more than just how much force you can concentrate in a region. It's about your opponent's assessment of how you would actually respond in a crisis, whether you would use those forces and pay the cost of doing so. If the US and its allies aren't willing or able to stop the Russian Federation in Ukraine for an annualised cost of a fraction of 1% of GDP, how might the White House go about making it a credible prospect that the US might risk a significant chunk of its economy and tens or hundreds of thousands of American lives in any potential escalation with the People's Republic of China? How can you make sure that US security commitments and alliances are still considered to be credible in a world where as long as it takes might actually translate into until the next election? And in a world where arguably the United States needs its alliance structures more than ever, how could Washington manage a strategic pivot so as not to endanger them? By virtue of its economic and military power, the United States will always have the option of trying to go it alone, but some pretty strong incentives not to. Because if the new White House wants to potentially deploy either hard or soft power to shape events in the Middle East or the Asia Pacific, just about anything you can imagine the United States choosing to do can probably be done more effectively with allied support. Sanctions or trade barriers adopted by both the United States and European Union, for example, are always going to have a lot more punch than those enacted by just the United States alone. And so it's a question as to how the US might try and make sure that it can still leverage effectively those alliance structures, even if it wants to deprioritise or move towards appeasement on what many of those allies are going to consider their primary security concern, the Russian military and the fighting going on, in some cases, not too far from their borders. These kind of questions are generally much easier to raise than they are to answer. And so I think it remains to be seen how US policy in Ukraine is ultimately going to be shaped by those kind of broader strategic considerations. But all that really just covers the considerations and options the US might have for trying to push the situation in Ukraine closer to a ceasefire. That would then still leave at least one major consideration: some of the serious risks that a bad deal could potentially undermine both Ukraine and US and allied interests. And as we go through this quite simple illustrative example, you might want to think back to two of those main factors we flagged earlier. In any given scenario, what is the starting balance of power between the two sides, and what way is the trend likely to go over time? If you get those two elements pointed in the wrong direction, you probably increase the odds of ending up in what, from a Ukrainian and allied perspective, is something we could probably call an unequal ceasefire. It's fairly easy to construct a universe where this kind of scenario might pop up. You can imagine some Western leaders deciding they no longer want to foot the bill for Ukraine's defence and they want the fight to end and end fast. At the same time, though, there's probably no way to do that quickly, easily, permanently and justly. Russia will want any settlement to involve all sanctions being dropped, all territory it claims, not just the territory it occupies, being acknowledged as part of the Russian Federation, and no entry of Ukraine into any alliance structures or any robust security guarantees. A lot of that might be fairly unpalatable in Western capitals, to say nothing of Kyiv, because it looks an awful lot like what it is: capitulation. What they might try for instead then is something that's meant to be temporary: a ceasefire. Something like a scenario where you allow Russia to remain in occupation of the territory it currently controls without acknowledging Russia's annexations of it, and you essentially freeze the conflict while negotiations play out and Russia pinky promises not to do anything else. There are a couple of reasons, however, that hitting the pause button, so to speak, might be exceptionally dangerous for Ukraine and its allies in the medium term, with one of the biggest issues being the interaction between build-up and burn rates when it comes to manpower and military equipment. When it comes to force generation, Russia has had a number of advantages over Ukraine, chief among them a much larger population to meet military recruitment requirements and truly massive stockpiles of old Soviet and Russian military equipment and munitions, with the latter being absolutely essential to Russia's ability to sustain the equipment losses they have so far. And yet the overall military balance between the two hasn't shifted anywhere near as dramatically as the difference in force generation might suggest. And while the front in Ukraine isn't universally stable at the moment, we also aren't seeing the Russians make any dramatic sweeping advances. That's consistent with a force that hasn't been able to build up enough of an advantage in combat power over its opponent to do more than just grind forward. The only way any of that makes sense in a world where Russia has consistently been winning the generation race is that if Russia's burn rates have also been considerably higher than Ukraine's. If Russia is able to replace 4 times as many tanks but also loses 4 times as many tanks, You wouldn't expect the tank balance to change dramatically over time, and you can apply that kind of logic in a more general way. Essentially, that suggests that one of the main reasons Russia hasn't been able to build up any kind of decisive advantage is because they've done a really good job of consistently grinding down their own force. But in a ceasefire scenario, your generation efforts can continue, while your burn rate doesn't. If there was a ceasefire and Russia kept producing and generating at the same rate, and Ukraine continued to receive additional support from the West at the same rate, the gap between the two forces would widen over time. And even that pessimistic scenario for Ukraine, I think, would require making fairly optimistic assumptions in two directions at the same time. Firstly, you'd have to assume that Western governments would continue to supply military and financial assistance to Ukraine at the same rate, even after a ceasefire was declared, which seems fairly far-fetched given a lot of the arguments we've seen in favour of a ceasefire are as a way to cut Western spending on supporting Ukraine. Indeed, we've already seen some countries like Germany announce military aid cuts for 2025, despite the fact that right now the war is very much still on. On the other side, Russian generation efforts might actually accelerate if a ceasefire came into place. Russian recruitment efforts, for example, currently rely on the incentive provided by massive monetary payments, balanced against the slight disincentive provided by the knowledge that if you do sign up, you may go to Ukraine as infantry and come back as a one-off payment to your family. In a ceasefire scenario, however, those incentives change. You might be able to convince recruits that this is basically free money. The war is over, you sign up, you get paid massively to march around a training field, learn how to fly drones, it'll be great. And so you give the Russian recruitment system time to bulk out its numbers, refill its units, make sure that people are trained, practiced, that equipment is properly issued. And given the Russian defence budget for 2025 is pretty much already in place, the Russians would be able to maintain their current rates of defence production without arguing that it was escalatory. They're just working through the budget as voted, nothing to see here. This could potentially provide Russia an opening to compound various advantages together. They could broaden the manpower gap and also take the time to actually train these new recruits, form them into coherent units, make sure that lessons learned through the fighting so far are disseminated and organisation is modernised. They could prepare new forward infrastructure, issue more equipment, shore up an air defence system that's been stretched by Ukrainian long-range drone attacks, and also spend the time to actually overhaul their equipment. There's probably a significant maintenance backlog in the Russian system, for example, for everything from fighter aircraft down to tanks and armoured vehicles. Give them the time to focus on that, rather than taking the next tree line on the way to Pokrovsk. And even if the Russians change nothing about the budget they've currently voted, you'll soon find yourself facing a Russian military that is larger, better trained, better rested, better prepared, better equipped, and has a higher serviceability rate amongst the equipment it has than the one you currently face. If some of the previous estimates we've covered about Russian recruitment rates or equipment reactivation and production rates that we've explored on this channel hold true, after about 12 months of ceasefire, you'd expect to see a fairly significant swing. A Russian military that's recruited about 360,000 new personnel for no losses, saw somewhere between an additional 4 and 13 million main caliber artillery rounds and 600,000 artillery rockets, significantly dependent, of course, on what future North Korean delivery rates turn out to be, plus very roughly 2,000 cruise and ballistic missiles and perhaps 1,500 main battle tanks. Now, yes, at that point, the Soviet stockpiles across the board would probably be tapped out or close to. But if the goal was to sprint to a position of relative advantage, I can't imagine why Russia wouldn't make the decision to empty everything it could and get it issued to units. And so now if you're Russia, the question is, what do you do next? And here I'd argue that from a game theory perspective, if your military advantage over Ukraine is constantly increasing, you know that Ukraine can't afford to keep up with you without additional Western assistance that is not forthcoming, but at the same time, you're not entirely satisfied with the terms of the original ceasefire, it might push Moscow towards one of two solutions. I'm going to split this into the patient or more risky plays. The slow boat method would simply be more and more extortion as you push through the negotiation process for a formal peace deal. The basic logic here is pretty simple to grasp. The wider Russia's potential military advantage over Ukraine grew, the greater the potential consequences for Ukraine and its supporters if the war ever started up again, therefore the more concessions they might be willing to make in order to ensure that it didn't. Russia could constantly ask for just that one more thing, and then another, and then another, and then another, stretching the process out until its competitors felt they had no option but to engage in deeper and deeper appeasement. And unless those Western states were willing to re-engage and re-escalate in a manner that would be far more expensive than it would be just continuing to engage right now in late 2024, they might be somewhat inclined to go along with it on the understanding that if negotiations broke down, Russia might choose to attempt door number 2. And that would be to basically attempt February 2022 again, but this time get it right. Unless you assume the Russian military leadership is pathologically incapable of learning anything, something which I think the last 2.5 years prove is comprehensively false, you can imagine the way that a second Russian invasion attempt might look very different to the first one. After 12 months stockpiling missiles and all of the lessons learned, I doubt there'd be a half-assed long-range missile barrage, as opposed to larger salvos than anything we've seen over the course of the war to date. Units probably wouldn't move across the border in an unmobilised state without enough infantry, using the battalion tactical group configuration that wasn't appropriately configured to take losses. We'd probably see assault units in the vanguard, not Rosgvardia units. There'd presumably be a comprehensive plan for integrating air power, long-range fires, artillery, drones, electronic warfare and other effects. And while Ukraine might have done what it could to prepare for this sort of scenario, given the gap in resources being fed in during a ceasefire period and the absence of any burn rate, this kind of second Russian gamble might be significantly harder to stop than the first. The basic point here is that for Ukraine, there is a significant possibility that any ceasefire that doesn't involve a massive inflow of resources and/or security guarantees runs the risk of just becoming a device for strangulation, one where Ukraine is forced and coerced to take a deal that ultimately sets it up for failure. And while re-escalating would obviously be a significant threat to the Russian economy, so too was continuing the war through 2023 and 2024. And yet we've seen the decisions that Moscow ultimately made there. And here's the thing, even if Russia doesn't choose to re-escalate and you find yourself in a frozen conflict scenario, if Ukraine doesn't have significant allied backing or security guarantees, it's probably going to face enormous challenges. It would have to somehow find the resources and manpower to maintain a large standing military and high state of military readiness to protect a long front line against an ongoing Russian threat, while also remaining on guard for a range of threats, ranging from missile attacks to hybrid warfare. In a sense, this would still be a war of attrition, only without most of the shooting, and the Allied assistance and lopsided loss ratios that have been critical to enabling the Ukrainians to hold the Russians off as effectively as they have so far. There would also be enormous risks for the Ukrainian economy, its sustainability and civil society. In this sort of unstable ceasefire scenario, for example, you have to ask, would companies really make investments in rebuilding Ukraine? Would risk premiums on debt come down? Would refugees in Europe decide it was actually safe to return home? Already, by the end of 2023, it was estimated that the reconstruction of Ukraine would cost something like $486 billion. But it's likely to be more difficult to convince foreign lenders, businesses, governments, and Ukrainian citizens abroad to engage in that mammoth process if they fear that Russia could more or less restart the war at a time of their choosing. In short, even if a ceasefire brought short-term relief to Ukraine, and most critically stopped the immediate loss of lives, it could, in strategic terms, end up being a trap for Ukraine and its allies. So then, as an intellectual exercise, what might it take then to flip the script a little? To take that ceasefire scenario and turn it into something a bit more optimistic and strategically stable. The key here is probably to acknowledge that Russia also has limited resources and vulnerabilities. The stockpiles aren't endless, its manpower isn't infinite, and according to information we've been given by Russian leaders, their economy is already experiencing such discomfort maintaining the war effort that one imagines the next civil war in Russia might not be a former catering boss against the Ministry of Defence, but instead the Ministry of Finance and Defence industry rolling in the tanks against the Bank of Russia in order to force them to forget about the whole inflation control thing and bring down interest rates. And so more optimistic scenarios for Ukraine and NATO probably rest on the new US administration deciding to turn the screws a bit on some of those Russian vulnerabilities. In the near term, for example, that might mean threatening to actually ramp up support for Ukraine and pressure on Russia if Russia doesn't shift its negotiating position. And when it came to a ceasefire scenario, you'd need to find a way to shift the balance of power, the trend, or both, in order to incentivise Russia to neither draw out the conflict nor escalate it. There are several non-mutually exclusive ways that could potentially be done, with 3 examples being continuing to support Ukraine militarily and financially during the negotiation process, so Russia isn't able to build up more of a military advantage over time, to maintain sanctions and coercive pressure on Russia until you're confident you have a lasting final agreement, again in order to reduce Russia's capacity and incentive to just use a frozen conflict phase to rebuild its military capacity before starting things up again. And you could potentially provide Ukraine with actual security guarantees, basically telling Russia that any future decision to start shit would come with high odds of getting hit. That basically suggests a scenario where the US decides to apply a lot more stick to Moscow, not just to Ukraine, and notably a lot of those terms would probably be highly incompatible with current Russian demands. And it's that kicker that brings us right back to one of the core challenges here. There are a lot of Western leaders out there who have said they want to see a peace deal, but a just peace deal. We've seen UK members and peers from all parties call on the government to make sure that Ukraine gets just terms, while the likely future US Secretary of State has said they'd be comfortable with a peace deal favourable to Ukraine that enables them to maintain sovereignty and prevents them being, quote, constantly held hostage by the Russians. Russia, by contrast, probably very much wants to be able to continue to hold Ukraine hostage and keeping it broken off and isolated from any sort of meaningful international security structure. Ukraine is deeply unlikely to want to agree to a deal that leaves them exposed and vulnerable. But in a scenario where Moscow thinks there might be appetite in the West for a rapid peace deal in the first part of 2025, that, along with swathes of Ukrainian territory, might be exactly the kind of thing that Moscow thinks it can demand. And so how exactly a future US administration might try and bridge that potential gap between Ukrainian desires for territorial integrity and security and Russian war aims is something that probably remains in the time will tell column. But here's the thing. All of those examples, scenarios and hypotheticals I just went through are just that, hypothetical. And there's almost no end to the ways that this could play out for Ukraine from late January onwards. And so in closing, I want to reflect not so much on what's going to happen, but instead, what are the major decision points and factors that we should watch for? Firstly, what closing moves are we going to see from the Biden administration between now and the 20th of January 2025? The key point will probably be just what supplies are committed and delivered during that time, and by extension, how much runway in military supply terms Ukraine is likely to have after the White House changes hands. The second point to watch is what will US policy settings on Ukraine be from late January onwards? That includes what kinds of leverage it's willing to apply, how much of it, and to whom. From both a Russian and Ukrainian perspective, however, once that US policy starts to become clear, it may have a very different weight to US policy in 2024. Through 2023 and 2024, Ukraine and Russia have both understood that if they just carried on the fight until November 2024, it was entirely possible that US policy would undergo a significant shift. That shift has now happened, and neither side, including Moscow, likely has the kind of resources you'd need to kick the can down the road again to November 2028, when the next US presidential election is meant to be held. Once it becomes clear what America's policy is going to be, European policy probably becomes the next massive question mark. For many European states, the strategic imperative to support Ukraine and hold back Russia is going to be abundantly clear. But while it's possible that Europe will step up in a big way to keep Ukraine supported, that kind of scenario is far from guaranteed. And then, even after Europe's policy position does come clear, where there are more negotiators involved than just those from Washington or Brussels. This is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and so ultimately both Russia and Ukraine get a vote in how it ends. And so it'll be interesting to see whether Russia tries to actually engage with any potential peace talks, or whether it will double down, gambling that future assistance to Ukraine is unlikely to be sufficient, allowing for it to potentially push on to a more favourable outcome. The Ukrainians, for their part, are likely very tired, but after almost 1,000 days of war, it's impossible to deny that they have consistently shown massive determination, even under incredibly painful circumstances. It's Ukrainian society that has felt the pain of the lives being lost, populations displaced, settlements levelled, and often spent nights without heating, light or water because of Russian missile attacks. And yet so far, their willingness to fight on has held, while their trust in Russia to actually honour any potential agreement that might be made probably hit near zero years ago at this point, and has kept declining since. Many Ukrainians are likely hopeful that the fighting will end or at least slow in 2025. But whether that happens and how that happens likely relies on a range of decisions yet to be made. And so now, just as before the elections, the fighting carries on as the world waits to see which way Washington will go. And okay, brief channel update to close out, starting with an apology for this episode coming out a day late. There were some unavoidable technical and time zone difficulties that meant it wasn't really possible to bring this episode together perfectly in time, so thank you for allowing me the additional 24 hours. That did, of course, allow some last-minute alterations to reflect the new permissions coming out of the US, for example, and so in the end, the delay at least arguably came with some benefits. Because this episode was pushed back a day, everything else has been too, so there will still be Purin Gaming content and Patreon content, just pushed back to the middle of this week rather than the start. But given how patient the patrons and Purin Gaming crowd have been, I am determined to get that stuff out this week. In terms of future content for this channel, I tried to keep this episode mostly focused on issues arising out of the US election, potential policy options, and future negotiations. But given we're hitting the 1,000-day mark since the Russian 2022 invasion, you should expect a broader stocktake of where the war currently stands to be coming relatively soon, which might provide some additional useful context for the discussion we've had today. I think that's it for the moment, so thank you very much all of you for your continued engagement and support, and I hope to see you all again next week.